All right, George Prochnik.
Thanks very much. One of the most disturbing things that I discovered when I was researching with people who are looking at airport noise and traffic noise and just the noise of the kind of environment that we live in and are hearing around us right now, is that while it is quite easy, in a very short period of time, we can psychologically habituate ourselves to incredibly unpleasant noise. Physiologically, we never habituate. And this is really important because it gets into a lot of the reasons that I think we have such a problem as a culture doing anything against noise. We tend to view vulnerability to sound as a sign of weakness. Get over it. Get over it. What's your problem? I mean, I had people say to me, people who'd been in combat, people who worked in airplanes, why are you complaining that maybe there's too much noise in New York City? You don't know what real noise is like. But in fact, the most rigorous, most recent studies that have been done on sound, people living in a 30-mile radius of an airport in Germany, were studies that monitored all of the stress signs in subjects when they were asleep and when they were awake for 24 hours, for a long period of time. These are studies that were done by a guy who was working with the WHO, with the World Health Organization. And what was very disturbing was that these studies revealed that even if you fall asleep, if your sleep is not observably disturbed in any way, in fact, when the planes went overhead, the subjects, something like 90% of people, all of their stress markers went up. There was increased blood pressure, heart rate, vasoconstriction, stress hormones were released. And these elevated stress levels continued for 8 hours after the night when people were working, even in relatively quiet environments. The guy who is the head of working with noise issues for the WHO, someone named Dr. Roku Kim, told me that at this point there is much more evidence that noise is a significant contributor to heart disease than there is to all sorts of other pollutants, air pollutants, which for a long time were associated with different heart problems. The evidence is there that this is really, really damaging. But in part because we get used to it, I think that we tend to think it can't really matter. So one of the main, I think, jobs before all of us is to resensitize ourselves to what our world actually sounds like. So when we hear, for example, that those noises over loudspeakers, it makes us pay a little more attention. And maybe we start to think that this is not an acceptable kind of environment that we live in sonically and start looking for solutions. I can speak a little bit, go into some of
well,
the...
what do you mean by a solution? What are we supposed to do? Wear earplugs all the time? Headphones with noise canceling? Everybody gets a Bose noise canceling head. Everybody tonight gets a Bose noise canceling headphone. Not
Two
really.
sets.
Two sets. One for you and one for you.
Let me come at the response to that in two ways. I'm going to jump to what I found at the end of my research. Well, I was looking, if you remember, I was looking at this question of has something changed in the environment? Is it actually noisier today? And it's not so simple as one might think, because in fact, if you go back to cities in the Victorian age, if you go back to cities like London near the end of the 19th century, because there wasn't zoning, you might be living next to a heavy manufacturing source, a factory, that would be much noisier than these honkings outside or most of what we're exposed to. So in fact, cities in the past could be just as noisy as New York is today. But what I found paradoxically is while it may not be louder today, there's less silence. By which I mean that cities in the past had more of what sound ecologists, people who work in soundscape, speak of as acoustical contrast. It was easier, even if you didn't have a lot of money, to find some undeveloped patch of land. There might be a cemetery near, or there might be a churchyard. Riverbanks didn't have roads running alongside of them invariably. You could find some way to escape. And I think part of why right now many of us feel such a sense of desperation in relationship to noise is because we don't have any easy way to get away from it. To a huge extent, I think that silence has been ghettoized in our current culture along two tracks. Either we have silence within certain religious traditions, not all, in which case if it's your practice, great, but if it's not, it's not an option for you to pursue silence in that way, or silence functions as a boutique commodity for the very rich. What we don't have are democratically accessible spaces where most people can easily get to from their place of work, their place of study, where they live to experience silence. There was a very interesting study done a few years ago in Scandinavia. There was a very loud street, and there were 2 rows of flats facing each other on this street. One of these rows of flats had a little back lot. It wasn't very nice, but it was just a space that residents could step out into. The other side did not. The people who had that back space, which wasn't right on the road, had a 50% less sense of aggravation by noise as the people on the other side of the street. What we need, I think, is some way, rather than wearing earplugs all the time, I think what we really need are ways of interrupting our experience of noise. And this is one reason that I came to think we've trapped ourselves a bit speaking of noise pollution. Why is that? If we talk about air pollution, or we talk about litter, there might be people who are indifferent to producing smoke or throwing a piece of trash on the ground, but very few people are going to say that's a good thing to do. I'm really glad I just littered right in front of you. Noise is a much trickier issue. As a friend of mine said to me, what I make is sound, what you make is noise. Your neighbor's dog always barks louder than your own. It's so subjective. It gets into so many different traps once we try to determine, well, should this really be called noise? Is that noise? I came up with a definition for myself that noise can be bad or it can be good, but it's sound that for the time that we're exposed to it, gets inside our head and dominates everything else. Maybe it's what we want at that moment, but it takes over our perceptions. And silence, I think one way to think about, rather than thinking of it as absolute silence, is that particular equilibrium of noise and silence which enables us to hear the richest, most complex weave of sounds around us. So rather than thinking about noise as a pollution problem, maybe we should think about it as a dietary problem. We have a very rich, fatty noise diet. Most of us, if we were to compare it to sugars and fats and salts, are living all the time in these very heavy, super stimulating sound, ingesting super stimulating sounds. And what we need is to break that up. When we think about diet, we don't just think of negative features. We also think, well, what kinds of things might make for a positive diet? And it's the same thing with sounds. There are different sorts of sounds that we know that science has, at this point, told us definitively are nurturing. There can be bird song. They might be noises, certain kinds of frequencies of falling water, or actually produce in us a sense of calm and a sense of focus, which many of us lack. Because, of course, the real issues with noise, as Todd was talking about, the house of distractions, I mean, noise calls our attention. Why do we hear? Our hearing developed in order to survive. We evolved from very small mammals who were living in a very hostile environment, and the sounds around them were ways to navigate and determine where their next point of danger might be coming from. We still respond that way. A neuroscientist who works with sound told me, every time you hear a siren, your body doesn't know that that siren isn't coming for you. It doesn't matter how blasé you might be. You're programmed at the deepest amygdala level to view that as a possible sign that you are in danger. So we need to create, I think, spaces, and this is in fact not, it's not an economically impossible thing to do, to create spaces that can give us at least a little bit, an oasis, a little bit of break from this enveloping din that we exist in right now.
Some kind of chill zone, New York City pockets.
Pocket parks.
Pocket parks.
You know, in the 1960s, the then commissioner of parks was someone named Thomas Hoving, who went on to become a very famous director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But he had this brief, very dramatic and successful tenure as the head of the parks. He created, with William Paley, who was at that point the head of CBS, a park in a lot where the former Stork Club was, which you can still go visit. It's just a block away from MoMA. If you look up Paley's Park, or you look up Greenacre Park, you can see two of what these pocket parks are, and understand how much of an oasis they provide, although they're incredibly tiny. These parks have water features, and they're planted in such a way as to encourage biodiversity in terms of different kinds of birds. And the foliage moves in the wind, and they're very pleasant places. And from the moment they opened, New Yorkers were really struck by how much you can read many reports of what a difference this made in the lives of people who lived anywhere near them. And Hoving found that you could make at that point 200 pocket parks for less than 10% of the park's annual budget. We've got vacant lots now. We've also got, in these economically difficult times, we've got a lot of stores that often go unused for long periods of time, looking for someone to rent them. I think we should have pop-up Zen gardens. Why not? I mean, these can be created very quickly. Why not take advantage of these spaces that at this point are underutilized and are just eyesores, and try to really spread out the silence in little zones where they're accessible to more people.
And then people just go chill out and how often should you chill out in a pocket park?
You know, I don't think there's any exact number of minutes, but I think that if you can find a few times a day where you can be in silence in some way, this is very helpful. I also strongly recommend that it's really worth everyone in the main environments where you spend time. Tomorrow, this week, close your eyes in those environments for a couple of minutes. Don't meditate. Just close your eyes and hear what you hear. Just try to hear as many different sounds as you can and understand what it is that you're already living in. I had an experience in the course of researching where I went to Columbus Circle, which is very near where I work, and I took part in an event organized by a group that did spontaneous meditation, where everyone would drop to the ground and meditate for 3 minutes, and with their eyes shut, there was a minder looking over us, and just try to do that in the midst of this difficult environment. And the main thing that happened to me was that by the second time I sat down on the street, I realized that what it sounded like around me was the soundtrack of a horror film. I couldn't believe how violent it was. And yet, I'm reasonably attuned to sound, and I was walking through that environment all the time. So I think it doesn't take that much to become aware of the world we live in acoustically. And with that awareness, I think might come an impetus to bring about some change. And
I feel like most of the noise I hear is just honking. It's mostly just taxi cab honking.
There's a lot of honking, and 98% of that honking does no good at all in terms of moving traffic. You know, there were periods of time in the 1930s in New York and in London where horns were completely banned at night.
What happened to that?
The really depressing thing about reading about the fight against noise over time is you have this sense of an enthusiastic reinvention of the wheel over and over again. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, you have these extraordinary moments where people involved in medicine and public policy people and police forces all band together and say, there's too much noise, we have to stop this. And there's evidence, and there's complaints by hospitals and schools, and there's real movement, and it all goes up and up and up. And then there are bigger problems, and it all goes down and down and down. And I think that one of the reasons this has happened is that we've just put it too much, maybe in a negative context. And we have to think about silence as something to aspire to, not only noise as something that we have to be afraid of. I mean, I think all of us at this moment in time, there can be a kind of self-compassion fatigue. You know, noise just becomes one thing too much to worry about. But if we start to think, you know, there's now lots of evidence about the positive effects of silence on concentration, predictably, on cardiovascular health. And if we look more on silence as something to aspire to rather than noise as something to be afraid of, and also if we try to break up the definition of what silence is and not look on it on these narrow, pious kind of channels. When my book was released, I had a quiet party at a magazine that I do some writing for called Cabinet. And at this party, everyone had to write on little note cards their comments instead of speaking. And I went in this room, and you know, we were there for a couple of hours, and what was really lovely was that at first, you know, everyone was sort of filing in, no one knew what was going to happen, but within a few minutes and within 15 minutes, what you heard was laughter. Around the room there was just laughter, really sweet and unoverly holy, just real joyous happiness. It was flirtatious and it was fun. And a lot of people came up to me afterwards and said, you know, I thought this was going to be like being in a church. I had no idea that silence could be so funny and sociable and sort of another way in which communication could happen. So there are all sorts of different kinds of silence. And I think, you know, silence is something that's very hard to speak about. I mean, there's a famous dialogue between the not very funny German philosopher Martin Heidegger and a Japanese scholar. They were talking about language, and they got onto the subject of silence. And at a certain point, Heidegger says, above all, silence about silence. And the Japanese scholar says, yes, because those who speak about silence produce the most obnoxious chatter. And these words sort of haunted me as I was working on this book. But it is something that we have to experience for ourselves. And we have to understand that the silence of a park isn't the same as the silence of a small Zen garden or of a group of people who are just not speaking. And all of these different microclimates of silence have their own rewards. And hopefully, if we explore them, we begin to understand why we'd want to cultivate more of them.
So what do? We put together like a bureaucratic sound council who's in control of telling everyone to shut up?
I don't think we want to tell people to shut up. You know, for me, one of the most poignant experiences in the course of my research is I've got a friend who teaches in a tough school in a very underserviced neighborhood. And he is a 6'4" basketball player, has a wonderful rapport with his kids, a real authority figure. And he told me he couldn't get his class of 10th graders to be quiet for 2 minutes. I didn't believe him. I said, it can't be true. I went to the school. I saw him try to do this again and again, and the kids were so overstimulated and distracted that no matter what he did, they couldn't be quiet, in fact, for 60 seconds. So I went home. I thought to myself, all right, how do we begin to work with this? All of these people all of these students must have had one experience of silence in their lives that was very powerful. And if I knew what those were, maybe we could begin to build on those and nurture them. So I asked him to speak to the class and get all the kids to think about one moment of silence that had really impacted them in their life. I went back very excited and sat down with this row of nice but troubled students. I said, all right, I turned to the first person. What was your moment? And he said, I remember when my father hit my mother, I didn't want to talk with anyone for a month. Second kid, I remember when my brother was shot in a gang fight, my father wouldn't speak to me, I couldn't speak to anyone in school. And we went around this room of 10 kids, I kid you not one of these sophomores had a single positive association with silence. Their only experience was of being silenced. So I thought, you know, what does it mean to tell these kids, shut up, be quiet, turn off your iPod? You know, we have to, as a society, we owe them a positive experience of silence so that they have something to aspire to. They don't know what silence is. And in fact, you know, I traveled around the world to Sao Paulo, to Mumbai. There are many, many cities which are louder than New York, and millions of people who go from loud homes to loud schools, on loud streets, in loud stores. We can't expect these people not, in fact, to turn up their personal sound devices or whatever it is they have, because, in fact, these are their ways of soundproofing themselves from the larger environment. Paradoxically, a lot of the noise that's being made now, I think, is people's efforts to find something like what used to be silence, a way of creating some kind of refuge from the sonic dumping ground that our streets really have become. So, you know, we need those of us who have been fortunate enough to be positively exposed to silence in nature or wherever it was, we have to share that experience and not expect that others are going to have it innately. Silence really needs a place in the here and now, you know?
So we need to get going and make some quiet time.
That's it.
It's all about quiet time. Well, thanks, George.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it.